even those so-called classic liberal, legitimate rationalists, the Kants of the world, the Hegels, all these type of people, they were all very suspicious of this idea that there's just this truth out there, that there's just this one way of understanding the world, because that doesn't exist.
Well, we got cooking right away. I didn't have a chance to say thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
But you've very artfully kind of mapped a bunch of things I wanted to get into with you. For those who are coming to these conversations, I think maybe from a more like beginner elementary level, I want to start kind of at the ground floor of conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
So just to start, what is a conspiracy theory? How do they form? What are symptoms that we identify of conspiracy theories? All that. Like, teach us the way you teach your students.
Well, one of the really difficult things about that is that like conspiracy theory research is still in its infancy. And one of the challenges I confronted when I started teaching this stuff was that like I don't have like hundreds of years of like previous people teaching this stuff to pull from. Like when I teach Marxism or anything like that, I have so much stuff to pull from to know how to teach this stuff. Whereas with conspiracy theories, it's a lot more difficult. There's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is just on the definition alone. There are quite a few disagreements among conspiracy theory scholars if they actually decide to define this term, which a lot of the time they don't. I mean, conspiracy theory is kind of like one of those things where you just say it, you say the word, and people are just like, they just assume they know what you mean, and vice versa. When actually, like when you get into the nitty gritty of it, I think that we find that there's actually a lot of ambiguity around what it means. So at its core, I mean, conspiracy, the term to conspire from the Latin meaning to breathe with like someone. It's almost like it implies a kind of like subtleness and a sort of like tacit communication. And in that was born the idea that to conspire means to work with or having two or more people working together, likely in secret, but I add a little caveat to that, likely in secret to attain some end, likely at the expense of others, another person or another group. Now, some of the key attributes are that a conspiracy theory is a narrative about two or more people, which separates it from just like fear of a threat, which might just be like one person or a bear or something. Like we are talking about a narrative that implicates a group, if we define a group as two or more. And this opens up a number of considerations because the conspiracy theory being a theory itself, that is speculation, narrative, hypothesis, it leaves open just up to the conspiracy theorist's imagination just how broad the conspiracy is. And if you look at the history of conspiracy theories, we find that they've often been used to justify intensifying national borders, like foreign policy, militarization, because if you believe that there's this conspiratorial threat coming, it gives you justification to bolster your own defenses, which have often then been used as a means to actually forward the agenda of the conspiracy theorist. So, for example, like Nazi Germany and the history of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in Nazi Germany is that the Nazis used Jews for and others and for many other reasons. But one of the things they pointed to was this belief in Jewish world conspiracy. And of course, this was a way by which the Nazis could cover their own global aspirations, right? They're the ones invading other countries. They're the ones invading Poland. But they're able to distract from that when it's like, oh, Jews are doing it. So therefore, we're just defending ourselves in our own kind of hostility. So when we're talking about conspiracy theories, what I try to teach my students is that there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot that's not so ambiguous that we kind of like know what's going on, but there's still so much to uncover. Now, where some of the other difficulties lie, and one of the things that I do to illustrate this to my students is that I go to some search engine and I type in conspiracy theorist, and we see what it gives us. And then we analyze this, and
Aliens.
Aliens, tinfoil hat type things. What is probably the first thing that comes to many people's minds. And then I use examples from like film. So if you type in a search engine like conspiracy theory films, like films about conspiracies and conspiracy theories, what is like really striking is that the vast majority of these films always depict some white guy. It's always a white guy, like searching for truth. So in that, there's like a kind of tacit exaltation of the conspiracy theorist as this person who's like searching for truth. You know, they're kind of like this renegade, maverick type who's fighting the power, fighting the cumbersome bureaucracy, and they'll fight it with the power of truth alone. You know, the truth will show itself. And I found that really interesting because for me, I'm like, well, conspiracy theories have to encapsulate way more than just like white dudes being suspicious of government authority. Like there's got to be way more to it. And when you start to dig a little bit further, or I found that there are actually way more conspiracy theories to be found among like specifically people of color, marginalized groups within the U.S. and elsewhere, people who've experienced historical state oppression, medical oppression, be it like biocolonial or biomedical oppression or anything like that, where there are tons of people who espouse conspiracy theories that aren't just like fighting the power type, like we're going to reveal the truth. And I found that really interesting when actually like digging into this stuff, how much the field was just focused on that first group, it focused on the tinfoil hat type, like white dude in the basement with the corkboard and aliens, that kind of thing, when there's way more to it than that. And I was wondering like what, when I started to research this stuff, I'm like, why is there this hyper focus on this very specific manifestation of the conspiracy theorist? Like what that looks like, who it is, being like the white guy searching for truth. These conspiracy theorists are often criticized, correctly so, for being oftentimes xenophobic, maybe racist, sexist, just trying to, forward their own, individual agenda. And we can cite as many examples of this as we want. We have Waco, Texas, the Oklahoma City bombing. These things are connected. And the general, very legitimate concern for like right-wing extremism and the conspiracy theory beliefs to be found among that group. Very legitimate. Now, the conspiracy theory research, where I think it sometimes falls short in its focus on that group of people, it is almost doing the same kind of erasure as those conspiracy theorists, in that they aren't actually considering all of these other conspiracy theories, all the different ways that they look, and what kind of truths, and I'm just going to put that in air quotes for now, what kind of truths can be actually discerned from those conspiracy theories. Now, there's this great book written by a researcher named Nicole Charles at the University of Toronto. She wrote this book called Suspicion, where she looked at embodied fears among women and girls in Barbados about the HPV vaccine. And she did all this great research there, many interviews and qualitative stuff, where she was engaging with these communities to understand and to contextualize their embodied suspicion of the HPV vaccine as like a biomedical form of violence against them, in its imposition, in the way in which people who, if they refused it, were deemed to be stupid or ignorant, or somehow like refusing to adopt the spectral light or fall into the spectral light of Western medicine. And in doing this study, she found that these people are not like, there's nothing, they aren't stupid. They aren't paranoid. Like, these concerns are rooted in real historical kinds of like biomedical oppression and dispossession. And so she argues that when these people are just reduced in these ways to being ignorant or something, we lose a more fruitful possibility of analyzing just like the histories informing these beliefs and like what they tell us about the current state of, in this case, biomedical oppression. And that is I think that there's so much to uncover there that often doesn't happen in the context of conspiracy theory research more broadly, because it's just focused on like, those white dude extremist types. And we should be studying that, like, obviously. But there's so much more going on, and it leaves so much on the table that just doesn't really get analyzed or unpacked, because it's like, oh, well, conspiracy theories, obviously they're just paranoid, irrational, we shouldn't take them seriously. And it's a shame, because there's so much more to uncover there, I think.
It seems like there's a and inevitably this probably exists, and I'm just sort of like proposing something that should exist. It already does, but it almost seems like there should be a taxonomy of like, okay, we have the conspiracy theory term to like get us in the building, but then there's a number of different ways that that manifests in relationship to the conspiracy itself and the data informing what the, I don't know, likelihood of the conspiracy theory being more accurate versus being more sort of confabulated.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe this already exists.
No, that's I don't. There are some things that exist like that, and people have been trying. And like this research is like totally in its infancy. Like conspiracy theory research can only really, we can really only trace it to having begun in like the 60s and 70s with, you know, at a little asterisk. Technically, people like Theodor Adorno and Hannah Arendt were describing the harms of conspiracy theories in the context of Nazi Germany in the 40s and 50s. But conspiracy theory belief really took off with a guy named Karl Popper and Richard Hofstadter. So Richard Hofstadter famously wrote the Paranoid Style of American Politics, where he writes about how in America, like paranoia is just part of the fabric of American society. And so it'll always gravitate towards conspiracy theories or use them as a tool, as like an actual political tool to forward political movements. Now, flash forward a little bit, where you get a number of other thinkers who did exactly that, who were trying to like sift through what are legitimate from illegitimate conspiracy theories, or one of their terms is like warranted from unwarranted conspiracy theories, which I think there's a lot of value to. I mean, if there's a conspiracy afoot, I want to know about it. You know, I want to know if there are people in power who are acting nefariously. Totally, 100% on board. Sometimes, though, that gets in the way of what I think are like possible analyses that go beyond the empirical veracity or truthfulness of the claim. Because like for those people in Barbados, for example, especially all those women and girls in Barbados, like they might not be factually true. Like these pharmaceutical companies are not coming in and trying to brainwash these people or depopulate them, like as far as the conspiracy theories go. But they are speaking to another truth. And one of the ways that I like to illustrate this is actually going back to Holocaust research, where there's a very famously researcher by the name of Dory Lobb had done a lot of research on one of the Auschwitz uprisings. And working with a team of historians, he was trained in psychoanalysis and other kinds of more interesting theories and approaches. He was working with a group of historians to recount testimonies and the histories of Jewish resistance within Auschwitz and other concentration camps. And he looked at this one testimony, or this team looked at this one testimony by this one Holocaust survivor, where I believe it was a woman. She described how during one of the Auschwitz uprisings, there was a number of chimneys that had exploded in the battle, in the uprising. And she got the number wrong. She, in fact, said, like, I can't remember the exact number. It may have been 5 or 4, when in reality it was like 1 or 2 chimneys had actually exploded. And so the historians that were doing this research alongside Dory Lobb were like, well, untrustworthy narrator, right? Untrustworthy account of the events. We have to discard this. And Dory Lobb was like, wait a second. Are we really going to pretend as though the truth starts and ends with the actual like events, like the physical events in the physical world here? Or can we find another truth in this? And the other truth that he proposed, and that has been like a mainstay for a lot of Holocaust memory and a lot of the politics of Holocaust memory, has been that she might have been incorrect factually in terms of what actually happened, but she was very much correct in that her testimony attests to the spirit of Jewish resistance to one of the worst genocides in human history. And in that is found another kind of truth, a truth that transcends and breaks away from, the physical world, the empirical facts of the matter. And I think the same can be applied to conspiracy theory research, where its history, as far as the research goes, has been marred by people trying desperately to be like, well, is it true? Is it true? Is that as though that's the only determining factor? And I'm like, well, there's so much more to uncover. Conspiracy theories are at their core narratives about power. And, I need to insist again and again and again, that does not mean that conspiracy theorists should all be listened to, or like we should pretend as though they are therefore narratives about liberation. In fact, we should first acknowledge that they have been used historically, as we saw with Nazi Germany, and we've seen many other examples before then and leading up to today. Conspiracy theories have been used as a tool of violence against historically marginalized people. No denying that. But that's not all they are. And in the case of like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the problem is not that they are conspiracy theories. The problem is that they're anti-Semitic. And that often gets ignored when the focus is placed squarely upon the conspiracy theories themselves, as though the problem with like racism or anti-Semitism is that it's just irrational people acting irrationally, hence they're adopting conspiracy theories. And so one of the solutions is like, well, we need more rationality. People need to be more rational, and that'll fix everything. That'll end anti-Semitism. I'm like, really? Like, is that really going to fix it? Like, we just inject a little bit of rationality and then everything's going to be fine. This book by a couple of Harvard scholars called A Lot of People Are Saying by Nancy Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead. It's called A Lot of People Are Saying, and it refers to Donald Trump's refrain, his common refrain that like, oh, well, he can spread certain ideas and he can defend it by being like, well, a lot of people are saying this, so there must be some legitimacy to it. And so they pick up on this to look specifically at the birther conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, which is just a racist conspiracy theory, like, of course. Now, throughout the course of this book, it's like a 170-page New York Times best-selling book, they only once use the word racism to describe this. And they actually don't use the word racism to describe that conspiracy theory. They use it to describe how some Republicans view Donald Trump as being racist. And I'm like, that's really interesting to me, in that they're looking at what is clearly an example of a racist conspiracy theory. But for them, the problem doesn't seem to be the racism aspect. For them, the problem is that there's this crisis of knowledge. There's this breach of epistemic legitimacy. And I think to myself, I was reading this, like, oh, so it's almost as though they believe that if we just had more rationality, things like racism would just go away. And with that is just a fundamental faith in whatever they think rationality to be, which completely ignores its historical context and how it has been used, like through scientific racism, through the way in which, like, even during the Holocaust, quote unquote, rationality was deployed to best organize how Jews would be shipped throughout Europe. They're using new like organizational techniques. They're using new infrastructure. They're using data accumulation and even data extraction in some of its earliest forms to move millions of Jews throughout Europe. This is like a kind of demonstration of Enlightenment, the success of Enlightenment, which is what people like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School were very concerned about, where we just reduce the world and people to a kind of instrumentalization. We just treat it as though, oh, if we just have more scientific progress, everything will be good. Everything else will fall into place. And in doing so, we ignore these other factors. We ignore these other things going on. So yeah, there's just so much in like what's going on in conspiracy theory research that I think is really valuable, but also in a lot of cases really limited, and why it, concerns for like its truthfulness it's important. Like I said, I mean, we should know if there is a conspiracy, but that's not the end of the story. Yeah. And yeah, I'm eager to see where the field will go in the next 50, 60, 70 years, if it will continue to be kind of commanded by this like kind of tribunal approach of being like, well, is it legitimate, the belief? Is it like likely that this conspiracy theory is true? And then if it does seem likely, it's like, okay, then let's study it. It seems like legit. But I guess, we'll see.
I'm fascinated by this. I'm thinking about there's kind of like a meme-ified tweet that's something to the effect of like, nothing will make you sound crazier than knowing 4 things that the CIA literally did.
Yeah.
And like recognizing that phenomenon to be true.
Yeah.
And of course that fits in sort of under the kind of like white guy tinfoil hat paradigm.
Yeah.
Even though who the CIA did those things to were often those sort of marginalized groups.
Totally.
And so there's this thing of like, that's coming up for me of like knowing that trying to disentangle that need to like for things to be true or not true, trying to pull out what's valuable about a conspiracy theory, even if it's incorrect. And then also the aspects of racism that are kind of, as far as we can tell, core to like human evolution. Like we have like a xenophobic impulse baked into us that theoretically, if we're evolving in positive directions, we're trying to evolve out of this knee-jerk xenophobia.
Yeah.
You look like you're about to say something.
No, I mean, finish your thought first.
Well, I'm just thinking through all of this, like kind of coming back to that like taxonomy idea of like making sure that we leave space to study all of it.
Yeah.
But also like, it's almost like a question of order, like taking the question of racism and then studying conspiracy theories under the banner of racism, nationalism, xenophobia, how those things are harmful, how those like extend the sort of arm of the state.
Yeah.
But then also having this other, maybe more neutral or like less charged way of studying conspiracy theories that allows us to, in reverse or retroactively, learn about what was happening and like what was in the zeitgeist at that moment.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a very good it's a very good point. And we're confronted with a fundamental problem here, where it's like, if we're actually going to take, like, as we should, like legacies of systemic oppression and racism seriously, I think that the logic and the rhetoric of conspiracy theory can actually be really good to understand things like systemic oppression, where like in the case of like enslavement within the United States and then Jim Crow afterwards, that's a conspiracy against Black people. Like after enslavement had ended, we saw like there were just so many cases of American politicians conspiring to spy on quote unquote newly freed Black enslaved people, to spy on them, to dispossess them, to guarantee that they wouldn't actually be able to enter into American society in any kind of meaningful way.
The police was a literal conspiracy. Like making the police was a
Exactly.
conspiracy to do this exact thing.
Exactly. And there's so much evidence of this. But it's interesting how like, are we just going to pretend as though these people didn't know that was happening, as though they weren't talking among themselves and being like, hey, I don't think we should trust these politicians, because I think that they don't have our interests in mind. I think they're conspiring against us. They may not have used that word,
right,
but that doesn't mean it wasn't a conspiracy theory. But I think it's totally legitimate. And I think that like the kind of truth that can be unveiled in people having these kinds of sharing this knowledge about the state of systemic oppression, how it is affecting them on a daily basis, is super valuable to understanding hierarchies within that world. And that gets completely ignored within conspiracy theory research, where they focus on like, yeah, what is the CIA up to? Or like, Alex Jones, like in every single one of these essays, or not every single one, but many of them are like just writing about Alex Jones and the harms of right-wing extremism and conspiracy theories. And again, we should study that. It's important. But conspiracy theories far predate that. They have a rich history of teaching historically marginalized people within their own communities who to watch out for. There was a really great book in the 90s written by Patricia Turner called I Heard It Through the Grapevine, where she looks at a number of different urban legends and rumors that extend through Black urban communities in the United States. So she presents some about how Church's Fried Chicken it was like sterilizing Black men. This was a conspiracy theory that was really went through Black communities in the 90s and 80s and 90s. And she looks at this and she's like, yeah, I mean, like these people, like what they've lived through, like of course they're gonna have like suspicions about these institutions. And I'm like, but we can go further than that. Like we can actually like use this rhetoric of conspiracy and conspiracy theory to, like you said, get our foot in the door for an analysis of what is essentially these power imbalances, these hierarchies, the way in which these worlds are structured in a way where it just They just like operate by continually exploiting entire classes of people. It's and we could take a Marxist angle and just identify it as a capitalist conspiracy. Take a feminist angle and identify it as a patriarchal conspiracy. And I think that that's really useful to give a name to what's going on and to get our foot in the door of starting to make connections and identifying things that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. One of the challenges, though, and there was a great book called The Black Atlantic written by Paul Gilroy, where he writes about the difficulty of actually grappling with the magnitude of enslavement, because enslavers had actually gotten rid of a lot of the documents that they had, like records that they had, because obviously it wasn't going to look good for them after the fact. And so it's difficult to find evidence of the actual like day-to-day magnitude of enslavement. There's tons of evidence for it. I'm not saying that, but yeah, we don't know what happened. No, that's not what I'm saying. But a lot of the evidence for him, he says, are to be found in places that are more ephemeral. So they're found in like quilt making, they're found in the cuisine, they're found in the music. And when you start to think about how evidence of like a conspiracy and of resilience against these conspiracies, in the case of enslavement, it isn't evidence in the form of like, oh, well, we have video footage of what had occurred and it's like we found the smoking gun of this. No, they're to be found in more imaginative and ephemeral places that don't necessarily lend themselves to like the epistemic legitimacy of like what evidence should look like. So not only should we be like taking conspiracy theories seriously, but we have to also be expanding what we even count as evidence for a conspiracy, where we have, so many examples in popular culture with like Oliver Stone's JFK. We can talk about JFK after if you want. Those files are going to be released apparently. But yeah, we have so many. We have films like that. We have the film Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson, Enemy of the State. All these kinds of films where they set a very narrow limit to what evidence for the conspiracy looks like. It's like, well, there's the USB drive that had all the information on it we found, or something like that, or like you have all these like this errant data that you're trying to account for, where errant data refers to something within an official account that isn't properly explained. And so the conspiracy theorist is like, look, there's a limit to your proposed idea here, the official account, so therefore this is evidence of a conspiracy. But when we're dealing with systemic oppression, in which there actually isn't like that kind of evidence, like it's hard to be like patriarchy, oh, it's that guy doing it. It is a system. Whereas like the conspiracy theory, one of the problems with it is that it does this thing kind of stubbornly, where it's like, well, we have to find those people that are behind it, those people that are behind it. When the conspiracy theory, or at least some of its value, I think, can really come from expanding what evidence looks like and who is implicated, to implicate not just people, but these systems, and how systems work in such a way as a kind of consistent conspiracy, especially against those historically marginalized, those historically silenced and dispossessed. But yeah, that's...
Well, now my brain's going in a bunch of directions, so I think we'll probably kind of like tessellate through the thoughts you're kicking up. But I'm thinking about how, thinking about back to Eddie Bernays and sort of like spectator democracy. And that was one way to essentially disguise actual conspiracies, but that, as you said, inevitably, so many people were probably aware that some aspect of this was happening. But the media infrastructure hadn't yet gotten to where things like the rumor mill could iterate with each other really rapidly the way they do now.
Yeah.
And so do you identify a shift in how conspiracy theories form, evolve, like with the advent of first mass broadcast and then getting into digital networks?
I mean, that's a very good question. And so one of the problems is that there haven't been that many longitudinal studies done of conspiracy theories to actually trace how their popularity has either gone up or gone down. Now, there's one like really important study that was done in 2014 and then replicated in 2022 by these two researchers, Joseph Basinski and Joseph Parent. And in 2014, in their book called American Conspiracy Theories, they did a study where they looked at more than 100,000 letters to the editor for the Chicago Tribune and the New York Times. And they found that across these letters to the editor, between 1890 and 2010, there were two spikes in conspiracy theory belief. There was around the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, and there was during McCarthyism. These were the two spikes. And one of the things they really insist on is that there doesn't seem to be a correlation with the internet and conspiracy theory belief, which flies in the face of what I think most people assume. I think most people assume, oh, it's the internet. Of course, we're going to see more conspiracy theories spread. Now, I want to caveat this by saying that the internet today is very different from the internet in 2010. Now, they repeated this study in 2022, and they came up with a similar conclusion. They also concluded that about 60% of all Americans believe in at least one conspiracy theory. And that's kind of been the case over the last 130 years, where it's very common. And the internet doesn't seem to have exacerbated that. There was another study done that found that just exposure to conspiracy theories, as the internet affords, won't turn someone into a conspiracy theorist. There are actually other factors at play. There's educational level, there's socioeconomic status, all these other things that play a part here. Now, with that being said, there's no denying that the internet has done very fascinating things with the rumor mill, with sharing information, with the ability to produce ideas and have these ideas be amplified, especially because now where you have these tech billionaires who can essentially sway elections just by tweeting a few things or doing whatever they do or Xing a few things. What is it even called now?
I think it's still, I don't know, posting.
The verb to posting a few things, where it can have such an effect on entire political systems. So obviously we're dealing with something that is it feels like a whole new beast to me. Now, one of the ways that this has been thought through in media studies circles has been to move away from technological determinism. Where technological determinism, the idea, right, is that, media or a medium or a technology is going to have great, vast effects on the social body and the very fabric of society. And obviously it does. But in framing it that way, it makes it seem as though these technologies just appeared one day. They just fell down from the sky. And then now suddenly we have these technologies and we have to reckon with their effects. And in doing so, we ignore all of the other reasons for that technology's emergence, the interests it serves, who's benefiting, who's not benefiting, how it actually comes to exist along a broader continuum of emerging media technologies and so on. And while I don't subscribe to technological determinism, it's hard for me not to believe that with the present age of social media, it's not having this kind of effect in spreading conspiracy theory belief, in essentially making it so that conspiracy theories are just another tool, as they've been used in the past, to drum up more hatred of, especially even myself, as I identify very, very firmly as an anti-Zionist, I'm very committed and very concerned about the veritable rise in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are just present all throughout. I just go on so many sites, it doesn't even matter, and I'm just witnessing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, despite my actual effort to only follow pages of Jewish groups and anti-Nazi groups. I'm still confronted with this, and I find it to be so interesting. And there's so many other things to consider as far as rage bait. Of course, when it comes down to clicks and when it comes down to engagement, of course these things that drum up hatred on both sides, the people who believe in the conspiracy and those who are against conspiracy theories, it's great business for these tech platforms because it produces engagement, it produces rage, it incites people to discourse. It brings them to the table to give out their opinions, which then various different algorithms are able to then take that data as far as the rage bait goes and transform it into better rage bait.
Yeah.
And it's this never-ending cycle. And this is one of the things that conspiracy theories and why, as far as the data goes, they haven't increased. The amount of the number and intensity of the circulation of conspiracy theories hasn't increased according to the literature. But I think it's really important to acknowledge the specific place that conspiracy theories serve within this broader tech landscape, where they happen to find they have a good home there because they are very good for exactly what I've described in terms of tech interest in expanding itself and just accumulating as much data as possible from its people. We find that is actually mirrored in the conspiracy theorists themselves. So if you think of the kind of typical conspiracy theorist, they're looking for clues, right? They're trying to find all the information. When I was a little teenage conspiracy theorist, you remember what the old internet used to look like, where it was like you'd open up a page and there'd be flashing stuff everywhere, just going down the rabbit hole of all these different pages and trying to find the truth. You see these tech platforms kind of doing the same thing with their users, where they're trying desperately to mine these users for all this information to find the truth of their interests, and then use that to encourage them back on. And there's this kind of reciprocal relationship between the kind of archetypal conspiracy theorist and these tech platforms, because then you get these archetypal conspiracy theorists that see the internet as like this endless expanse of evidence for whatever they're looking for. And then you have the internet. I'm just going to homogenize the internet for a moment, but understand. I know it's more nuanced than that. The internet is like, that's great. These people keep coming back and they keep giving us their data, and we're going to keep mining them as they are mining us. And so you see with the conspiracy theorist and a lot of the anger and suspicion that it kind of elicits, this comfortable alignment with this algorithmic culture, with platform capitalism, with endless data extraction, with just selling your eyeballs to the internet, to advertisements, to everything like that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something that I always feel like I need to say in terms of being the literature says that there aren't more people believing conspiracy theories now. But it's something, it just doesn't feel right, Yeah. And so I try to find these other ways to think about what has changed with the internet. Hence this idea that there's this comfortable alignment between the two. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
It seems like from my perspective and the research I've done, it's not so much obviously, let's take a sort of low-hanging fruit example here of the QAnon umbrella of conspiracy theories, plural. That was in its way monolithic.
Yeah.
And people do, even in this very decentralized, kind of fractured, echo chambery sort of social media landscape, people do crave the thing that everybody's talking about. So no matter what, we do sort of adhere back into monolithic structures. Yeah. But I think what's a little different is the kind of adjacency factor, where all these people can be playing this kind of conspiracy LARP, and they're doing it with their friends and making new friends, and kind of you've got these loose ties and strong ties. And so the way that the conspiracy theory can manifest, even though if you zoom all the way out, it's McCarthyism, it's probably just a conspiracy theory at the scale and velocity of McCarthyism.
Yeah.
But it can kind of it can kind of popcorn a little differently.
That's exactly it. It can popcorn differently, and we don't know what that looks like yet. Partly, one of the challenges is that it's actually really hard to know what the internet looks like. The internet, believe it or not, is pretty big. And to actually, the kind of research that is still required to understand the effects of the internet, what communities actually look like on the internet, how people are united on the internet, what actually brings them together, what other groups are they part of on the internet? These are big questions that I think, the internet is 30 years old, at this point, where in its actual daily popular use.
Yeah, the web is 30 years
in its
old.
infancy. Yeah. And I just think I'm trying to figure myself out, and I'm that old. I'm I can't even figure myself out, let alone trying to figure out what the internet is. Wild. And so we're we're confronted with this. We're confronted with this impossibility of trying to put all these people together, and we use terms like conspiracy theorist, and we're supposed to all know what that means, and we use it, we kind of pat ourselves on the back, oh yeah, we know what they look like, we'll clump them together, they're this one group, and then we homogenize them, and we end up just not fully understanding them in the process, which is one of the risks. And one of the reasons, perhaps, or one of my hypotheses, is that that we haven't seen an increase in conspiracy theory belief, at least according to the literature, is that there's been a concomitant increase in the amount of like real information, at the same time, where the internet, yes, it makes it easier for people to be exposed to certain deleterious ideas or ideas that might lead them astray from other possible forms of analysis. So they'll turn to conspiracy theories. But they can also verify things easier. And I'm not saying people do that, but that is there. And that might be a reason why there hasn't necessarily been an increase, because there's been a subsequent or concomitant increase in the ability to verify information, which isn't always reliable.
Sure.
Obviously not. But I mean, that's just one hypothesis I have, but
I like it. And it sort of brings us to 2025, because obviously the other kind of piece that you brought up here is like the broligarchs and like thinking about how it's almost like social media that we had in the 2010s was like a digital version of noblesse oblige, where they were like still committed to the idea of social media, like connecting people in like the public square. And of course they weren't that committed, but openly that was their like, that's what they were trying to purport that they were doing, that we're connecting people, we're making the public square. Any semblance is gone now. And now essentially like, it's almost like the phenomenon of private equity has now been applied to both social media and like the, sort of broader American government. And so everything's just being sort of strip mined and sort of rendered worse and shitified, as Cory Doctorow would say. And so thinking about that, there's something here that I want to sort of like open up, and I don't even know the right way to frame the question, where it's like you have the ascendancy of a figure like, RFK Jr., you have the ascendancy of Elon Musk, you have other tech oligarchs following in the sort of footsteps of Elon Musk. And like when I see Elon Musk, I see like a radicalized teenage boy, and exhibiting all the hallmarks. I do obviously have very bad feelings about him at this point, but I'm not even saying that pejoratively. I mean, like he literally feels to me like when you see radicalized teenage boys, he's operating in a very similar way. He just happens to have almost $500 billion to sort of weaponize it.
yeah.
So we're now in this context where the social media environment has actually been weaponized by conspiracy theory prone individuals to promote conspiracy theories. That does feel categorically different to me, but maybe I'm like doing the thing where you like over fixate on the current moment.
Well, I think both is true. I think that we're confronting something that's just fundamentally new, where you have someone who has like this microphone that they're able to just scream at the world with it all the time. And the more incendiary they get, it's not going to be confined to their social media platform, because all the big news networks have to cover it too, because that's how they get their clicks. And I use this example deliberately to be like, it's almost too easy to be like, oh, Elon Musk is like a child, even though I agree. Obviously, I agree. He's a product of what is just the next stage in like capitalist expansion in so many ways. Like, of course, it extending into the tech landscape. But if we're going to be talking about like the end of like freedom of speech, the end of rationality, if I can claim that ever existed, I mean, my concern is still like with the George Bush administration. I'm like, it's interesting to me how we tend to focus on like the tech landscape today as being like the determining transformation in American society. And I'm like, American society has like been historically so horrible that it's almost like, I mean, not the society itself, but I mean, as far as American foreign policy goes and the unbelievable violence it has inflicted from Vietnam to Iraq, Afghanistan, like unbelievable.
But 9/11 was an inside job, bro.
9/11 was, 9/11 was an inside job, yeah, which is like easier to believe for some people than this was an act of people resisting American hegemony. And it's like, well, the conspiracy theory then in that case is something that actually makes it a lot more palatable and is a way to actually kind of tacitly defend America, where it's like America is still great. It's just there was the few bad apples in government who decided to like overthrow it. It's it's the swamp in government. We get rid of that and America will be great. Or it's like, oh, if we just like fix Twitter, whatever it's called, with the child and made it better, then everything would be great. But it would still keep the tech the current tech landscape intact. Where like early Twitter and Facebook, I mean, Facebook had the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal. Like these are horrible companies. Like they're horrible. They're not singularly horrible. Even though, again, I agree, there's something different about this now that I don't fully understand. But like these companies are not singularly horrible in that they represent something totally new. Like this is just belonging to the history and trajectory of capitalist exploitation. And of course, capitalism wasn't going to be content with just mining the world for all of its finite resources. It was going to then turn to humans as points of data extraction, like as things to mine and to better understand so that it can better market to them. Like we're just on the same trajectory. And that's one of the risks when it's like, oh, well, we're in unprecedented times, right? And I'm desperately waiting, that meme. Like, when was it precedented time? When was it great? During Reagan, Clinton? Like, when was it great? Like, and in that, and, the kind of more popular examples of conspiracy theories like 9/11 and JFK and stuff, all these, they often work in a way to absolve the US of its sins. To be like, yeah, it was just a few bad actors. It was the CIA. You just get rid of that and then everything would be fine. I'm like, what is the America you're claiming to return to? It's a kind of mega thing, like, but in a strange kind of inverse way, in that it viewing America as a problem, but America can be redeemed from itself, which is like, I still don't know. Was it when the formation of America was built on genocide of indigenous peoples all throughout here? Was that when it, Yeah, I'm fascinated by it, but I mean I don't know. What do you think? Like what is singularly new like about the Twitter age today, or X, whatever? Like what is the new thing?
Well, I mean, I know that we both have a great appreciation for Jonas Varoufakis, and so obviously like the framing of techno-feudalism I think is worth bringing up, where it's not so much that it's, terra nullius, but rather it's a recycling of something that's been gone for so long that we forgot what it looked like.
Right.
Where we're like bringing back rent seeking as the dominant mode of exploitation.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. I mean, the whole thing on rent, because I can't claim that I understand this stuff. I mean, as far as economics go, I get like, I'm spooked
Same.
about like digging into economic stuff. But that is totally it. I mean, I think that's definitely a part of it. And Jonas Varoufakis would obviously know best about that, or one of the best about it, as the ex-Greek finance minister. But like, for me, it is an interesting step in terms of like the history of capitalism, where in the early political economic analyses of capital and of capitalism, you have people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, where David Ricardo more so than Adam Smith, David Ricardo like focused a lot on this question of rent and essentially how rent is determined, where in that context, he suggested that rent is determined by the quality of like the worst land. Because if you were to move somewhere and nobody had actually was renting out any of the land, it would be free, because there's, and they aren't thinking about indigenous people or anything. They're just like, the land, it's all there for you. It's, of course it was God put it there. It's for you. Just take it. And this idea for him is like the price of that land then goes up as more land is kind of picked up and decided upon. But in the tech landscape, we aren't dealing with like geographic limits to what is available there. Like there are, like I can't start a tech company and I'm going to have it be meaningful at all. And so we're confronting this monopolization and oligopolization. That's a word, right? Oligopolization of these quote unquote spaces. But like we're imparting this, what is a kind of age-old political economic analysis onto what is like not physical. Like this is not space. It does take up space. I'm not denying the fact that there are these warehouses that have unbelievably deleterious effects on the environment, where they're hosting all this data, like clearly. But the actual like landscape itself of the internet is spaceless. Cables aside and warehouses aside, yet these analyses still apply, and they project into like this kind of not only the, I guess, what seem to be limitless possibilities of capitalist expansion, where it's like not only are the architects of what is currently capitalism interested in going into outer space, they're also going deeper into cyberspace as like an area to appropriate, to lay claim over, to turn into profit, to turn into property. But these are like it's ephemeral. And it brings me back to the philosophy of like Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, the French philosophers, where they were essentially setting the stage for this kind of analysis, where they're like, capitalism is going to like become more and more ephemeral, and it's just it's very logic. And this is like, we saw this with the way that capitalism just overthrew, not through violent means per se, but overthrew the very logic of like borders, where it's like, what do nations mean anymore? Even like politics, it's like, we aren't voting for the people who have power. We aren't voting for, when we vote, we're not voting for the tech billionaires who can sway elections. We're not voting for the pharmaceutical billionaires. We're not voting for these people. So what power do we have as citizens? What power do states have as like sovereign things, if we believe that there should be sovereign states, in the face of this like growingly ephemeral thing? And it just follows the trajectory of capitalism itself, where capitalism is like, no more distinctions, no more borders, really, nothing like that. We're just going to go wherever we want. And then boom, you saw at the inception of Twitter and Facebook, these people being like, this is how we're all going to be connected. This is going to unite us all. But not only that, it's going to open up this new public sphere for proper political and kind of insurgent possibility in opposing governmental oppression and repression, which is what like Musk is currently like. He loves to spout this kind of stuff, but he cozies up to Trump. But he's like, he views himself, I think, if we're taking him to be earnest, like he views himself as this renegade who's fighting the power. And so too, in the early days of Twitter and Facebook, they were like, this is what's going to liberate the people from government censorship and authority. But now, we're seeing, like, of course, that's being turned back against us. And in that is then offered this idea that it is the logic of kind of ephemerality, and which just happens to mirror the logic of capitalism, that's going to free us. What an amazing trick that capitalism has pulled on us. Like, that's a conspiracy. If I'm like, what an amazing trick, in that it has offered itself as the solution to the problem it has created. Like, it's just going to feed itself. Like, the conspiracy theorist never sees an end to the chain of like inquiry. We're seeing that it's like, well, capitalism sees no end. It's ready to go anywhere. It's ready to go to Mars. Like, what are we going to do there? I don't know. There's rocks.
Die.
What are we going to do there?
Have a horrible irradiated death.
Yeah. But like, there's no limit. And there's no limit. And like in the popular imagination or understanding of the conspiracy theorist, there's no limit to their own inquiry. The conspiracy theorist never says, figured it out now. It's done. Yeah. Because it's a theory.
Like how you said, who's doing the patriarchy, the ultimate trick of capitalism is that, and this gets to that quote that you often hear of, like, the thing about conspiracy theories is that they're comforting. Like, the reason people gravitate to them is because it feels comforting to imagine that there's some cabal pulling the strings, rather than what's actually true, which is that, like, the world is ungovernable and constantly teetering at the edge of some form of chaos. And so there's a similar thing at play with capitalism, where as much as I want, like, as much as I emotionally want to like blame Elon Musk for the sort of the ways that the information ecosystem is sort of inshitifying, this is something that is playing out at the system scale. And there are people contributing more than others, but it's not, you couldn't necessarily locate it with just like one person.
No. And that's exactly it. It gives us comfort to be like, he's the problem, or Trump's the problem. And I applied it in the case of Trump. You look back on any of the other American presidents, and like, actually, as horrible as Trump is, like, if you are actually going to think about the value of human life, like, there's no one that compares to like George Bush in terms of the carnage in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East. Like, if we approach this assuming that these are human beings, like who suffered under American imperialism, like Donald Trump is tame, as horrible as he is. Like I want to make it extremely clear, it's not as though it's a good like response to American imperialism of the past, and it's probably, you know, we're at the beginning of this election cycle. We're gonna see just how bad it gets.
Right,
But
he might
like,
go for the crown.
that's it. Yeah, I mean, I'm Canadian. Like his Governor Trudeau thing, very funny. I thought that was very funny. Like that's a funny joke. But I'm Canadian, and it's like, yeah, that's a scary thought. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not worried for myself as a Canadian. I'm worried about like what that kind of rhetoric is going to mean for the future, where you're having this guy at the highest political office emboldening,
Yeah. Yeah, you got it.
his people, but future Trumps as to what, you know, what are the possibilities of political discourse? Like, what does that look like? So, I mean, as scared as I am about Trump, I mean, I think that comparing it to the, you know, as soon as you compare him to the past, it's like, what was really better before then? Like even with Obama and Guantanamo with the drone striking, like it's horrible, absolutely horrendous. But also I'm really worried. What does worry me is like the future. I'm worried like what comes after Trump, and it's not like as though any individual is like the culprit here. All of these things are symptomatic of, I mean, we're in LA now. Like we're seeing the effects of climate change. We're seeing the effects of unbridled capitalist development and resource extraction. We're seeing the devaluation of human life on a global scale. That's like, I'm sure it's happened before, but it just seems like it totally new in a certain way that I can't fully grasp, and that really concerns me for what the future, what's going to happen in the future. And so all these things like tend to get ignored, right? When it's just like, oh, it's just Musk, it's just Trump. You know, if we just got rid of that, then everything would be great. It's like, no, I mean, that's one of the harms of, you know, when conspiracy theory belief is just about feeling comfortable, then it stops us from having or looking at things more broadly and looking at these systems in place, looking at history, looking at how these things belong to various continua and aren't just, you know, some haphazard coincidence like Trump is some aberration or Musk is an aberration. Like, no, these are all these oppressions, all these oppressors are connected, and they share, like they belong to these various histories, be it capitalism, be it patriarchy, be it just the logic of xenophobia, be it queerphobia, transphobia, and it goes on and on. Like none of that is new, and they are just picking up on what are these like fundamentally deeply ingrained things, and such analyses of such things becomes impossible when it's just like, oh well, yeah, these are the people behind it, and we'll just focus on them. Even though that might be a good way to get the conversation going, it shouldn't end there.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, that we figured it out.
Well, I mean, you brought up Los Angeles, and I think this is a good time to talk about the various conspiracy theories related to the fire, or fires, I should say, sorry.
Yeah.
The various conspiracy theories related to the wildfires. And I want to bring this up and start with my personal experience and sort of throw it open to you, because also you have the kind of like refraction of like being a Canadian living in Los Angeles experiencing this. But one thing that I found, it's like I sort of watch the way conspiracy theorizing and information online can all kind of, in this, what we might sort of cautiously call a slightly deviated context from the past with digital infrastructure, where you had conspiracy theories around, oh, there's not water in the hydrants. And then it turns out, oh, that's actually true, but it's not because it wasn't, like that has to do with climate change and, you know, a lot. I'm not going to like litigate that particular idea, but that then becomes a whole thing that can be conspiracy theorized.
Yeah.
And then the funding of the fire department or lack thereof, and like what the timeline of that funding becomes a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And then claims of arson and claims of like LA being a shithole. And then, well, there were some instances of arson.
Sure.
And we don't know exactly what certain, so it's like, there's this kind of like, pun intended, perfect storm for conspiracy theorizing to play out. But because we're still in real time, we actually can't litigate proverbially what's accurate or not. So we have to sort of like hold it. We have to sit with all of it uncomfortably.
Yeah.
Or I had to sit with it all uncomfortably.
Yeah.
How did you experience that? And given the depth of your research, how are you like responding to what you were seeing play out?
Right. Yeah. Because I was watching it from afar in Montreal, but like I seeing all those conspiracy theories, and it's not a radical or a new thing for me to say this, is like these conspiracy theories are largely meant to distract from the reality of climate change. Like, of course, it wasn't climate change; it was these bad arsonists that were trying to burn everything down, and like even conversate should have been important conversations going on 24/7 about climate change and about how this was drying up the wells and the fire hydrants that created the conditions for these wildfires to spread just so quickly, without us also considering like how was this land, how are the people on this land for thousands of years able to live here harmoniously and not have to deal with such things like indigenous practices of maintaining the land. We didn't see conversations about that. We saw on dare I say mainstream media, conversations about arsonists, about looters, just all contributing to this idea that, oh, it's these bad human actors that are should be drawing our concern. And this is like a broader thing, I think, with like a certain cultural obsession with like crime podcasts and crime television and stuff like that, because it's so much easier to be like, yeah, there's a few bad people out there, instead of thinking about something like something horrible like crime, thinking about it in terms of like actually a common thing that's baked into the social fabric. So, for example, like the stranger danger idea, a common thing in a lot of on some of the most popular crime podcasts, is like the importance of respecting the stranger danger idea, that you should be wary of every stranger you encounter. But strangers are not the ones who are inflicting harm on people. It's most of the time, intimate partners, parents, other relatives, people that they know. But to acknowledge that means acknowledging that there are systemic factors here. It means acknowledging, to go back to one of the famous feminist mantras, that the private is political, where things that are happening in private are not happening in isolation. When they're happening, like in the case of women and gender-based violence, what women are experiencing, it isn't just like their own experience. All these women are experiencing this, where you have like conservative estimates of like 70 to 80% of women describe having experienced gender-based violence in their life at some point. Like that is a horrendous number that's telling me like there's a conspiracy out there. There's a really great documentary film. It's called Rape Myths on Trial, and there's a lawyer's giving a talk during it, and she's describing how she uses this rhetoric of conspiracy to say that there's essentially a patriarchal conspiracy that prevents women from being able to comfortably like provide testimony or come forward about cases of like sexual assault because of all the barriers that they'll confront in the criminal justice system. There's the immediate barrier that even like friends and family might give them, like, oh, well, did it really qualify as an assault? And then if they manage to get through that barrier, then they have to confront the barrier from like the police and of course all the stonewalling that they're going to do. If they manage to get through that, they have to confront the barrier of like the criminal justice system that often doesn't go in their favor. And so they're confronting all these barriers. And in the film, the speaker gives the example or suggests that this is like what she calls the unnamed conspirator. And in that is a move away from like this focus, going back to the fires, on like these individual people and an emphasis on these systems. And that's why like conspiracy theory can really be a useful tool to begin to make these kinds of connections, to be able to see where something happening over here and it's happening here and then happening there. And it's like, wait. Let's draw the connections here. Let's get the corkboard out, let's get our little yarn. We'll draw the connections and we'll be able to identify essentially what is not an individual or private thing, but is a systemic one. And it's like from there that I think more fruitful analysis can take place, especially in the context of like the LA fires, where it was like an immediate threat to people's, even today, I still think there's like, the threat is not nothing. It's still a threat, even though we're hoping for rain. It's still a serious threat, and not to mention the future. And this is January. Like, this is wild. What is the summer going to be like?
Yeah.
It's very scary. And it was, when I was looking at it from afar and listening to all the news and stuff, I was like, I cannot believe that they're talking this much about like looters and arsonists and all this. Like, how come not all of the coverage is about the status of the climate, about how the United States is like has been failing miserably at meeting various climate benchmarks and demands and everything like this. The per capita consumption in the U.S. and like how just like the overall logic of consumption found within the capitalist system is just going to push us further and further down this climate catastrophe. But we're just not looking at it. We're looking at these individual bad actors that are probably the culprits instead of the systemic things going on instead. And yeah. So I mean, on the one hand, that's the challenge of like what I try to do. And you've heard in what I've been saying, where I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, conspiracy theories are a distraction. They point the finger at these few bad actors instead of looking at systems. And then I'm like, well, conspiracy theories can actually be a good way to start to analyze these systems. And I think both can be true, but it's about like distinguishing them and fine tuning what conspiracy theory research can like look like to get at the heart of embracing both how they can be limiting in terms of proper social and cultural and systemic critique, and how they actually can be quite illuminating in performing these kinds of critiques and allowing people to draw these kinds of connections to identify systemic factors, and then to actually like not hold people but hold systems accountable and hopefully change them. I think it's like the key.
Boom. One thing that this is sort of bringing me back to is you brought up the paranoid style and the idea of like American hegemony, but also America as like a nation with people inside of it.
Yeah.
And the like weird interaction and thinking about like Foucault's boomerang, like there's all these things that make like evaluating conspiracy theories in America in this context interesting. I won't say that it's like, utterly novel, but it's at least interesting. And so some things that have come up already that we haven't maybe dug into are, you referenced JFK.
Yeah.
But also then thinking about aliens.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to blow the doors open on that. Like inevitably you talk about this or teach this, I have to assume.
Yeah, I do. But like in the context of JFK, that's the 1 week, because how I structure my course is like every week is kind of a different theory. And then we look at the various historical considerations and analyses and stuff about it. And the 1 week on JFK is the 1 week where I'm like, I want y'all to try and like believe me for a minute here. There's some weird things that happened. Now, obviously, I think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating JFK. My point is purely to just be like, people who think otherwise aren't like irrational. If we're just believing in these like terms of rationality and irrationality, like a lot of strange stuff happened. I mean, JFK was rolling through this with his motorcade, and Lee Harvey Oswald managed to assassinate him after firing like 3 or 4 shots and successfully hitting him twice, I believe, and a task that's very much possible and has been proven time and time again to be possible. Where some of the other stuff is like strange about it is like what Lee Harvey Oswald did afterwards, where he goes home and then within a few minutes of arriving at home, leaves again and is just prowling through the streets after having assassinated the president of the United States. Strange, okay. Within a few minutes of leaving his home, a police officer is pulling him over for suspicion of being the guy who'd murdered JFK or someone looking suspicious. And I found this really interesting because this is the early 60s in Texas, where suddenly, maybe for the first time in American history, white people were all under, like every single white man was a potential like assassinator or was like a criminal essentially. And within a few minutes, this cop is pulling over this guy. Lee Harvey Oswald ends up murdering him just in cold blood right on the street. And then Lee Harvey Oswald just continues on his way to go down his merry way into this like crowded part of town, walks into a store. Somebody sees him walk into the store because they think he'd actually like ducked away from police, which hasn't been fully never confirmed. But they see a white guy walk into a store and call the cops on him. And it's like, it's amazing how quickly they were able to do it. So it's like this moment within the segregationist South where it's like, you have a white guy being like, you know, the most wanted person in America, and they catch him within a few minutes. Like, really, it's amazing. And for that not to raise some suspicion, I think is like a total, to totally ignore the context at the time where like white people weren't the ones who were subject to like continued police evaluations and stoppings. And all of a sudden, the police are just working ultra efficiently and are able to catch this guy in just like a few hours. Like, it's amazing. Like, and as soon as you have any kind of historical knowledge of that period, it's like, that seems like out of this world possible, but it happened. And so it's like these people aren't like irrational, even though I'd rather they didn't believe that it was like the CIA or the mafia or Cuba or anything like that. Obviously not, or the Russians. But it's just fascinating. I do the same thing with the flat Earth conspiracy theories, where in response, very much like to JFK, a lot of conspiracy theory researchers are like, "Oh, these people are irrational," and I'm like, that's just so reductive. Similarly with flat Earth people, but the flat Earth people earn the ire and the attention and anger from like scientists and stuff for peddling, you know, falsities about the shape of the Earth. Fair enough. I mean, the Earth is round. I'll just make that very clear. But if we are actually going to truly be objective, the Earth isn't round at all. The Earth is a nothing within a cosmic sea of nothingness. And it is actually the fact that we attribute roundness to it that's just something that as human beings we've done to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. In the fact that we know nothing about the universe, we know nothing about shapeliness at all. And alongside like a reading I get them to do about flat earthers, I get them to read Nietzsche's On Truth and Lying in an Extramoral Sense, where he talks about exactly that, where he talks about the way in which there's this obsession with like putting names on things. And he gives the example of a leaf, putting a name on a thing, and then we just do away with any kind of like possible interrogation of what that name means. So he gives the example of a leaf. And so you can apply it to anything. Let's say a tree, where if I say the word tree, in yourself and your listeners, you've conjured up the idea of a tree in your mind. All those trees that we've now thought of, if we were to draw them out, would be totally different. Yet we use the word tree that is meant to encapsulate all of these differences. And Nietzsche's like, it is for that reason that language will never actually allow us to access truth, because language is just like a representational system that doesn't actually represent things in the world, because there's no such thing as a tree. What is really common between a palm tree and a spruce tree and an evergreen? We've just agreed that they're all trees, and we insist on like identifying various commonalities between them, how they grow, you know, how they actually sustain themselves, and we use this as an organizing factor. And for Nietzsche, he gives the example of like a mammal, where he's like, mammals don't exist. Mammals is a term that we use to organize certain kind of species. And Nietzsche says that the scientist then goes out in the world after having constructed this idea of what a mammal is and points at a thing and is like, see, look, it's following all the characteristics I've laid out. Therefore, that thing is a mammal. The thing is not a mammal. It doesn't know what a mammal is. How can we claim what we know more about what that thing is than it does? But this is like part of this scientific like obsession with putting names on things and setting like truths that leave little possibility for negotiation. So to go back to the flat earth thing, I use this to apply to the flat earth people to be like, the earth is not flat. But for us, the only response to that to be like, oh, they're irrational, they should understand that in fact the earth is round. Let us interrogate what assumptions these scientists are using to actually measure the earth being round. They're just looking at it from the vantage point of being right outside the planet. But that's only one vantage point of seeing the earth in its shapeliness. If we wanted the true view of the earth, we would need to take it in its totality within the entire cosmic abyss, where we find that it is like less than an atom of nothingness, just floating in a sea of nothing. That is objectively what the earth is. And for anyone to say that, oh, it's round and not flat, without taking the extra step and interrogating their own ideas about what it means for a thing to have a shape, for a thing to exist at all, they're just saying, my form of rationality is better than your form, and accept that or face the consequences. And I want to really emphasize, the earth is round. the fact that we know it's round is really important for being able to like fly airplanes and stuff. This is all very important, but it's just interesting the way in which certain people are deemed like irrational. There's something wrong with them. They need to be, dealt with in certain ways, maybe even institutionalized because they're like not rational enough. And I'm like, well, maybe we should interrogate what we think rationality is. Maybe we should interrogate what assumptions are guiding our ability to even have knowledge in the world at all. Like, whose interests are being served here? Like, why do we obsess over the world being round? Again, it's round, and that's a great thing to know. It was a great discovery, but like, how does it change my day-to-day life all that much? There's that great song like "Whitey on the Moon," where the artist sings about how he can't pay any doctor's bills, but at least Whitey's on the moon. There's a white guy on the moon. Like, thank God. Thank God we're thinking of colonizing Mars when there are people who can't afford their housing or food for themselves and their children. Like, but thank God we're sending ships into outer space because of the knowledge we have about the Earth being round. Like, wow, amazing. Like, we've really made it as a society. And yeah, then aliens. What do you think about aliens, Jesse?
I mean, I think this gets exactly to your point, which is we have such narrow understandings. Like, we've codified intelligence, sentience, life in very particular ways that more and more people are starting to erode, or more and more people are sort of like trying to intervene those kind of like fixed understandings. Because of course, like, there's the whole issue of like, are plants intelligent?
Yeah.
Seems to me like they are, but they don't have a brain. They don't have a nervous system the way we understand it.
They aren't humanoid.
They aren't humanoid, right? For folks watching and listening, we had a chat off camera about our shared frustration about the continued archetype of the humanoid alien. Because of course, aliens could be any size. Aliens could be fungus.
They could be the size of a city.
They could be the size of a city. They could be the size of a planet. And so then, yeah, like the idea that in the vast universe in which there are more planets than, grains of sand on Earth, that there would be even one species that we would sort of we identify as sentient and intelligent the alternative seems foolish to me to assume that doesn't exist.
Yeah, totally.
But then even broadening the aperture from there and saying, well, what about all these life forms that we haven't here on Earth even managed to, like, we allow ourselves, it's the Peter Singer argument, like we allow ourselves to subject mammals to these brutal lives when we know that we evolved, like we're very, very recent kin to these animals. So we know that they experience pain the way we do. There's all this, people still holding on to like Enlightenment ideas that like animals don't experience pain, which is just like so on its face weird and silly and like, used kind of to the point you said earlier about like instrumentalizing the world. But so we can't even come to the like conclusion collectively as a society that these other beings are life. How do we ever expect to identify it out in the universe where things get way weirder?
Yeah.
All of that to say, yes, I think aliens exist.
Yeah.
Do I think that aliens are visiting planet Earth and have recognized that we have this specially abundant water source and are sort of jockeying in a Game of Thrones or kind of like epic fantasy novel sort of battle with each other to determine what the fate of this planet are? No, I don't think that's the case.
No.
I am epistemically humble enough that I'm not saying that it couldn't be possible or that if somebody presented compelling evidence to me that I wouldn't change my mind. But like if I had to, put my bet on the table, I'd say no, I don't think that's likely.
Probably not. And it's, globally, most testimonies about aliens have come from Americans in America. And I'm like, this is kind of an extension of American exceptionalism, where if there are these aliens coming to visit the Earth, why are they going to Kansas? Why? They could be going to like Jakarta or Paris or like Hong Kong or anything, but no, they're coming to America. Like, of course they'd want to be in America. This is the site of all things culture, and of course
it's the center of the universe.
Center of the universe. Of course
you've experienced it firsthand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As a Canadian, I've always lived in the shadow of the of America. And it tells us a lot. Like these alien narratives, like the humanoid thing. our obsession with other life forms while we just systematically murder like factory farm animals here that we know are like living things that feel pain and joy and stress and anger. Like these are real emotions that these creatures that we share the earth with experience, that we're so willing to just discard and subject to unimaginable horror from birth till death. And we romanticize about the possibility of there being life somewhere and how they might treat us. What a weird like fantasy projection. And like it's almost like we're pointing the finger at ourselves, but we're not actually able to identify that. Where it's like, are we really worried about aliens coming and subjugating humanity? Or is this just us, like a momentary, like almost like a dream reflection, Freudian slip about us realizing, us in the West, like realizing like the kind of violence that we've subjected animals to, that we've subjected people in the Middle East to, we've subjected indigenous peoples to. And we like then put that onto like, what if they come for us? You know, what if they come for us? We've done it to so many different people and animals. Like, of course, like we should be scared, and we should have this like deep anxiety. We should always be prepared for it. And it even goes so far with films and graphic novels. The graphic novel like Watchmen, where within Watchmen, how it concludes, spoiler alert, is like this idea that you can unite humanity under the recognition of this common threat, which is actually a very common thing within conspiracy theory land, where it's like having a conspiracy is a great way to unite people. It's a way to be like, well, they're coming for us, so we should prepare. We should prepare like our defense, as I said earlier, and stuff. And I go so far with this as to be like, it might be that conspiracy theories made it possible for us to have the first states at all. Be they like Jericho, that has all these defensive wall systems before they even had agriculture, where they were essentially defending the land, this kind of fertile, resplendent plot of land after the Younger Dryas, where there was a lot of heating up of the planet and a lot of vegetation was just kind of naturally growing, where the people of Jericho, they're like, we want this to be ours. We don't want those people to get it, whoever they are. There's no actual evidence that there were these battles that took place. So there might have been like an actual, like, it might have been a conspiracy theory that they were like, well, I want this land for us. And if there are people over there, we better put up some walls here. And it is perhaps because of a conspiracy theory that we have like these walled ideas about borders and states at all. And that's why it's like so important. And that's why they can tell us a lot about how people think, what their fears are motivated by, and what their fears are actually intensifying in terms of like national political aspirations or anything like that. And so there's so much to uncover there. Just like there's so much to uncover in terms of what alien narratives tell us about, be they, I don't know, or another possibility is that alien narratives, especially those that involve abductions, happen to be sexual in a lot of cases. Like perhaps these narratives are like a kind of, Freudian slippage of a certain like desire that is foreclosed within American Puritanism or something like that. That is just like a way by which people can actually, engage in these kind of fantasies that they have that wouldn't be permitted to them in regular American life. I mean, I don't know, but there's so many possibilities, whether like, who cares if aliens are real? Like there's so much to understand from the narratives about them being real, that to me, that's almost more interesting than if an alien shows up, it's like, okay, we have the answer. What do you want? We'll talk. I hope you don't hurt us. But yeah, there's so much to uncover even outside of that I think is worthy of examination, and why we have to take these things seriously. I think
this feels like a really good time to bring up the role of anti-Semitism in conspiracy theories, because from my perspective, and this is admittedly, I have the Western bias that I have. This seems to be the most consistent through line of conspiracy theories. Okay, I'm glad to hear that validated. Like no other form of xenophobia has persisted quite in the same way in the popular zeitgeist the way anti-Semitism has.
Yeah, I don't think there's another comparison.
What is that? Why is that? Like, what are we dealing with there?
Depends who you read. It depends who you read. So one of the texts that I really pull from to understand this is Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which she wrote about five or so years after the end of World War II. So Hannah Arendt, a Jewish woman who had to flee Europe and fled to America, obviously during World War II. And she suggests, she provides a lot of different explanations for this. Some of them aren't super satisfactory to me, but like one of the things that she points to is that it was as capitalism was starting to take hold that Jewish people, some of them, like happened to have money. Just like so many other groups, there were people within these groups that had money. Now, because Jews had experienced thousands of years of discrimination, of dispossession before then, what had happened was these the few wealthy Jewish people, which wasn't representative of actual Jewish people that were mostly like peasants, especially in Eastern Europe, the few wealthy ones were wealthy in a finance capital kind of way, like with other groups as well, but they didn't have the same kind of historical historical associations with them. And when that happened, you saw, this is what Hannah Arendt says, we saw that there was a new animosity emerging in response to capitalist exploitation, where people were starting to live worse and worse lives because they were being exploited by capitalists at an ungodly level. But their anger wasn't directed to capitalists. And this is kind of the broader history of like reactionary responses to capitalist exploitation. It's like, it's never the capitalists, it's the immigrants, it's women, it's another group that's the problem. What had happened was there was this new disdain for people who were rich without having earned it in their eyes. And so Jewish people, those few wealthy ones, this is what Hannah Arendt says, became this kind of scapegoat. So you get the George Soros ideas here. You get the Rockefeller idea here about them controlling the world because they had this wealth, generational wealth, granted, that they happened to possess, was then used as evidence of them having acquired it through nefarious means, and are then going to use it to take over the planet. And so the Nazis picked up on that. Well, they didn't pick up on this. They were speaking to what was the broadly anti-Semitism all throughout Europe. One of the big misconceptions is that it's just like Nazis in Germany were the only anti-Semites. It's like, no, like the horrors conducted against Jews in like Romania and Hungary and like all throughout the rest of Europe, like it's unbelievable. And it attests to these histories of just like targeting Jews for any number of reasons. I mean, some of the historical reasons is the Christian belief that Jews killed Jesus. Like there's that. And as the Christian church was gaining in power, of course, it's going to like have this influence on the European people as to like who their enemies are. And Jews serve a very important function in that way because they are within those states, they're the stateless people. But occupying, living in these places, they could then serve as like the perfect scapegoat because they're actually present among these people, but seen as being exterior to, like inside, but exterior. And hence, or here comes the role of like scientific racism that Hannah Arendt picks up on, to be like, Jews were then marked as being like of a different race than white people. And the same would extend to like Irish people, people in South Africa, like white people in South Africa, and other kinds of kind of arbitrary designations of like different classes of whiteness. And that could then be used to justify this idea of Jewish inferiority or Jewish, a kind of like gene that predisposes Jews to wanting to be like, to take over the planet or something. I mean, like really wacky stuff, but it has these histories grounded in, anti-Semitism that goes back thousands of years that the Nazis and others in Europe picked up on, and hence why they were so willing, and so many leaders all throughout Europe were willing to participate with the Nazis to actually round up Jews and have them flow through Europe to the various concentration camps or to British-occupied Palestine at the time. But all of this is all evidence of the fact that anti-Semitism has deep, deep, deep roots in American. It would extend into America, of course, with cases like Henry Ford, and even to this day, where we're seeing like anti-Semitism take on. It would be drastic of me to say a new form today, but anti-Semitism is like so unbelievably common, which I think I said before. Like just going online and seeing just how much anti-Semitism there is. And I do the thing where I peruse like some of those more like 4chan type sites just to get a sense of what the state of anti-Semitism is today, where there are just so many different examples of it from so many different angles, where even from like Zionist anti-Semitism, which has its own interesting history, like in the case of Israel, where Israel within Israel, it's kind of a strange thing that Hebrew is the kind of spoken language there, because Hebrew wasn't really a spoken language among everyday Jews for like ever. It was a kind of like the scientific imposition of what was a rabbinical language that rabbis had used to communicate with one another and to read the Bible and read the Torah. That language was then transposed as the language of Israel at the expense of languages like Yiddish or Arabic, because there were tons of Arabic-speaking Jews or Yiddish-speaking Jews, of course, especially in Eastern Europe. So what had actually happened in Nazi Germany too was there was these divisions between Western and Eastern Jews, even within Jewish communities, and there was a lot of bad treatment of Eastern Jews by Western Jews, and vice versa. I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this, and I don't want to suggest that it's like as simple as this, but there were these conflicts here, and a lot of these conflicts would play out in the creation of the state of Israel upon Palestinian land, where it was imposed that the primary language would be Hebrew, and there would be a lot of anti-Yiddish elements. Some of the reasons for that is that a lot of the Yiddish-speaking Jews were socialists. A lot of the Yiddish-speaking Jews were anti-Zionist, in that their attachment to Judaism was not going to be filtered for them through Israel. And this would come at the expense then of all of their ways of understanding Judaism, where if they didn't experience it the right way, they were going to then be seen as being a self-hating Jew, which is like how Zionist anti-Semitism can manifest sometimes. Now, we see that play out today, where you have like organizations like the ADL be surprisingly chill with Elon Musk giving what appears to me to be a Nazi salute.
Allegedly.
It looked like it. But I can't
He's sending
say.
his heart. He's sending out his heart.
Sending out his heart. It's really, it did it twice. ADL being very chill about that, but being very not chill with organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, where you see in like the defense of Israel, like this suspicious willingness to align with people. And Elon Musk has a long track record of saying anti-Semitic stuff. Like just a few years ago, and he had to go to Israel and make like this show of apology, and that he actually they seem to have no problem with him now, even though he's doing what looks like a Nazi salute. And you see the ADL and these other groups being very hard on actual Jews who do not align with what Israel is doing, do not align with what Israel means for their own Judaism, and see themselves as being like, and I think very rightly so, so many of these Jews view themselves as being not only subject to what are actual rises in anti-Semitism, where we are seeing the return of many different popular anti-Semitic tropes, that Jews are just interested in global domination. And so there are many people co-opting the anti-Zionist movement to be like, look, see what's happening in Israel? This is an example of Jews trying to take over the world because they're trying to take over Gaza, trying to take over Palestine. And you're seeing this really reprehensible stuff emerge. So there are Jews experiencing that. And on the other hand, they're experiencing this kind of Israel-inspired Zionist hatred and vitriol because they are refusing to locate their Judaism within the state or see it through the eyes of Israel, which is like, I can't imagine how hard that is, because I'm not Jewish. And if I was a Jewish person and my faith was being questioned, I couldn't go to temple. I couldn't practice my faith because people there weren't seeing me as being a proper Jew for not properly bowing down to Israel. When Israel is just 75 years old, give or take, and the millennia of Jewish persecution never involved Israel. It wasn't about like people having they're showing their allegiance to Israel, and these Jews recognizing that the way in which anti-Semitism has historically manifested had nothing to do with Israel because it didn't exist, had everything to do with Judaism. We are seeing that this strange willingness to give a pass to these historical examples of anti-Semitism while cozying up to or while being very angry at Jews who are fighting for Palestinian rights, fighting for not having their faith be reduced to Israel and its economic, strategic, foreign interests. Like, for them, that's just totally, for so many of them, it's just so, it's like almost blasphemous to think like that is what their faith should mean. But yeah, anyway, so that's, there's so much to think about in terms of like the anti-Semitism, its attachment to conspiracy theories. Like, it is, these things go hand in hand. Go hand in hand.
Wow, there's so much there. I'm also, you know, it's funny. We've made it this far in the conversation and not once brought up theory and philosophy, which is your excellent YouTube channel, podcast. Like, it's how I found your work originally, and just happened that you're moving to LA for a little while, which made it doubly awesome. But also, you're sort of a fascinating kind of figure because that channel is a sense-making channel. Like, you're not targeting that at scholars, you're targeting that at the public. And you're sense-making these complex ideas in theory and philosophy. And post-October 7th, you took a pretty explicit pro-Palestine bent. But you're also somebody who, as you've just demonstrated, are super attentive to the ways that anti-Semitism, both explicitly, but also how it can be Trojan horsed into so many different kind of conversations. So I want to open that up in the context of this, like how you were thinking about the ways that you were shifting what you were covering, what you were explaining, how you were relating to your audience, and of course, how your audience was relating to you, without perhaps inadvertently feeding some of the very things you know to be high risk factor zones of, you know, anti-Semitic thought and social configurations.
Completely. It's a very difficult thing to navigate. It's very difficult because so much of this, like even using the word Zionist, can for some people be construed as anti-Semitic. And indeed, there are people out there trying to make it so that any criticism of Israel or being anti-Zionist is itself anti-Semitic. So, you know, really pushing for these ideas and really pushing for a free Palestine is, you know, it is going to be dangerous territory. And I've been kind of overwhelmed with the amount of positive feedback I've gotten. There's been a lot of negative feedback too. And, you know, I always got to keep my eye on it because I got to make sure that none of it is like has any real merits to any threats or anything like that. But there's something that just changed in my mind, like just shifted in my mind, because I always viewed my channel and what I did as being pretty political. I mean, I was covering the history of philosophy, but I was saying, like, and I believe this to my core, that the history of feminism is the history of philosophy, that the history of critical race theory is the history of philosophy, and these things have to be considered as well. It's not just about like Kant and Hegel and Plato and all that stuff. That stuff's cool too, but I think that there's room for all of this, and there's a lot of room for it to be put into effect. And yeah, after October 7th, I remember there was one bit of footage of watching some Palestinians be brutalized by drones that it just flipped the switch in my brain, where I'd never seen anything like that before, like to that level of depraved, just arbitrary violence. That it was like, for me, like, what kind of a hypocrite would I be if I didn't immediately try to do everything I could with the platform into trying to procure funds through fundraising and stuff, but also like offer people what I think to be a fairly level-headed presentations of this history, so that people can understand what is going on there. And people have largely responded. Honestly, like, one of the really things that surprised me, because when I started it, I was like, admittedly, I didn't know a whole lot about this history. And it's only over the last year and a half I've been like really dedicated to learning about it. I was surprised at how few people offered rebuttals to anything I said. And that's not the case for a lot of my stuff. I mean, I say a lot of stuff that I'm just like wrong about, and I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, you're right. With this, the number of times where people have said what I think is like a substantive critique of what I said or my position in the way that I've like covered texts like Nora Erakat's work, or like Edward Said or anything like this, like you find that these things are actually the situation, as complicated as I know it is actually incredibly simple. It's incredibly simple, but we are living in a world that like chooses to make certain things really complicated because of certain interests. Then it's like, it's too complicated. Whereas like when it comes down to like trans youth or something, then everyone feels like they can have an opinion and saying like how children should receive childcare, medical care, and everything like this, and they can just say whatever they want. But when it comes to Israel Palestine, it's like no, this is a complicated thing. This is complicated. You can't say anything about that. And I was really surprised at how few, and I can't think of many examples of people who actually gave out like substantive critiques beyond being like, oh, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, the kind of parrot talking points. And of course, all of this just completely ignores the history of Israeli occupation, dispossession, the Nakba, the various different operations and violences Israel has inflicted against Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Lebanese, Yemen, people in Yemen, like so many different people. And interestingly, because the history of anti-Semitism and the history of conspiracy theories go hand in hand. Like I teach these things side by side. You cannot talk about one without the other. I'm starting to see a shift, not among conspiracy theory researchers yet, but in recognizing like the new blood libel. And the new blood libel within like Israel is that all Muslim people are out to get Jews in Israel. But this is just a reappropriation of the same conspiracy theories that have been used for millennia against Jews. And so you see so many things like about this like persistent threat of the Muslim threat against people in Israel. And it's interesting in that case, like, and I don't feel yet this kind of obligation, and this just reflects poorly on me. I don't yet feel this obligation to teach conspiracy theory stuff alongside Islamophobia yet. I'm not doing the whole section on like Israeli conspiracy theories against Muslims, even though there's no end to the amount of stuff I could pull from. Like you can find so many examples of conspiracy. Even on October 7th, the number of falsehoods that were spread about that from the Israeli government, that Haaretz, the Times of Israel, the New York Times, BBC have uncovered that a lot of the stuff that they had initially claimed had happened didn't, and they suggest, some of these people, that perhaps it was a cover-up or they had exaggerated things for the sake of justifying their invasion of Gaza. Why can't I study this? And I know very well why I can't. Obviously, it's the career ending. If I were to actually apply the same kind of analysis of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to Islamophobic conspiracy theories, which would inevitably implicate Israel, I'm doomed. And that's just the state of things.
You think even now how sort of, conceptually here, the kind of battle lines have been drawn, and I feel like there's a strong kind of youth movement toward obviously pro-Palestinian sentiment.
Totally.
And so it makes me wonder, like, I'm not doubting your hypothesis, but I guess I'm asking for clarification. Like, why is that? Why do you feel like that's a career ender in 2025?
I think that the pressure that's currently being put on colleges and stuff by the ADL, Brandeis Institute, that have been very successful at places like Harvard to effectively change college policy vis-a-vis Israel, and to make any criticism of Israel, construe that as anti-Semitism. Even at my college, at Occidental College, that just agreed to its own resolution, Office of Civil Rights resolution, with the ADL and Brandeis in response to a number of complaints, legitimate, very concerning complaints of anti-Semitism that needed to be addressed. The college adopted kind of, would take into consideration things like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that would mean that anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism could be construed as anti-Semitism. So in the classroom, and it's not like bad at my college, but at places like Harvard, it's really bad, where there's a real risk that in the classroom, if I were to teach on this stuff, if I were to teach on Israeli conspiracy theories, a student could charge me with anti-Semitism, and I could have like a Title IX complaint against me, and then I could very easily lose my job.
Mm.
And so there's the real material situation right now where it's like, if you're a hiring committee and you know that the person you're hiring has these views, it'd be easier to just hire someone else. It's like, it'd be easier to not have to deal with that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's the case everywhere, but it's just like a material, like people assessing what is going to be a headache for them in the future, assessing like what interests they need to pander to at the college level. And all of this is like, these are real difficult things to navigate. And I'm interested, I hope, I mean, I share your optimism. I think that there is a real movement, and I count myself to be a part of it, in trying to like oppose these narratives, oppose this hegemony within the academy and outside of it, like in opposing Israel's occupation of Palestine and continued dispossession of Palestinian territory, and it's horrendous. I'm hoping that it'll eventually culminate into like an actual lived reality for Palestinians to live free, and even for Jews all across the world to be able to experience their Judaism the way that makes sense to them. And so that they aren't like, their Judaism isn't assessed in terms of their allegiance to Israel. And I think I mean, what a beautiful future that would be. After October 7th, Hamas proposed two possibilities of returning the hostages. Don't enter the Strip. This is reported by the Times of Israel. Don't enter the Strip, and we will return all the hostages. Israel refused. But also, Hamas proposed, a leading Hamas official had told the Times of Israel that like, if Israel agreed to redraw the 1967 borders, which would mean respecting the Zionist dream of having the state of Israel, that's still the state. It's still there. Hamas would lay down its arms and become a political party for 5 years. It would lay down its arms and be completely armless. This is what it was willing to do. And this was just totally ignored by Israel as a possibility. And instead, we get this, like, we're just seeing the state essentially just try to expand itself into Palestinian territory. And one of the ways to illustrate this is, for any of your listeners like listening to this now, look up zones A, B, and C in the West Bank, and you'll quickly see just how much of the West Bank is just under Israeli rule. And that's just how it works. But what are substantial and I think extremely important critiques of Israeli foreign policy and the way that Israel is just how unbelievably evil it is in vis-a-vis the Palestinians, this gets construed or gets transformed into like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish world domination and stuff. And what a way to absolve Israel of its sins, of its violences, and what it's doing there. And so yeah, it's for me, and this has transformed into much more than just into my own anti-Zionism, but it has transformed into like a much more serious care for real political movements and global events in a way before I was admittedly way too far removed from and not engaged in, thinking still that like the world of theory and philosophy was something that we do on our own. It's armchair philosophy, life of the mind type stuff. I'm totally dissatisfied and disenchanted with that now. And it has translated into a little bit of disenchantment with academia in part because it's not always a great site to make these kinds of changes. And yeah, so this is, for me, like, that was a catalyzing move in what, for me, I'm going to make my mission to being much more of a political activist, perhaps even working with Yanis Varoufakis' party, actually, because they're trying to get into Canada, their DM movement. So we'll see about that. But yeah, it was definitely a change for me. I feel it in my body. But yeah.
I love this as the soft launch interview of your political career.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's it. I don't know if I'd be a very good politician. I mean, I have too much. I think I would sink any political party as soon as anyone did any research into me. They'd be like, "This guy, okay, that's gonna give the right wing way too much ammunition." I don't think it would be very successful. But
what are you? I mean, if not, an explicit politician, when you're thinking about like maybe relating to academia differently, even to the extent that maybe you don't participate in academia, do you have form to what that looks like as a life?
Yeah, I want to do more community local work in wherever I am, because I'm not sure if I'll still be in LA next year, but if I'm back in Montreal doing way more community work there, like on a local level, because I've also grown incredibly disenchanted with just like scream politics on Twitter and stuff, where I'm like, this doesn't change anything. Like, I think it's important to spread messages and to show the world that there are people out here thinking these things, and that's important, and that has some function. But I want to be way more of active in my community, as like actually helping people day to day is my what I'm eyeing as being my future. But I'm also just so drawn to education in so many ways. Like, I love teaching. I think that teaching calls to me in a way that like I wish I could do it very easily forever, and I intend to, as far as my YouTube and podcast stuff goes. But as far as like an actual career option, I mean, it's also just hard at the college level because there's so few jobs, and it's very competitive, and there are people who do this stuff a lot better than I do. And I think that where I best fit is as like a teacher and like as an activist, because I think that, you know, I have a platform like yours. I mean, what you're doing, like in the very important work in bringing on like experts to talk about these things and to show people like that there are people having these like serious conversations, that's not just about like climate change denialism on some other podcast that I'm sure some of you all heard of before, or anything like that, but are actually bringing people on to discuss what they've been thinking about for a long time, and to to emphasize the urgency of these things, and like what should be done on a macroscopic and a microscopic levels to guarantee that we still have an Earth in a few years. Or let me rephrase that. I think the Earth will be fine, but that we still have, people and other life forms on this Earth.
A habitable Earth.
A habitable Earth. That's
and fellow Earthlings to share it with.
Wouldn't that be great? I mean, don't we have an obligation to our prospective future children, maybe at like the most selfish level? If we're just thinking about humans, like, shouldn't that be enough? Like, let alone making it sure that there's still animal life and plant life and all the other kinds of life around. Like, at the most selfish level, that seems like justification enough for us to want to keep the Earth around. Keep it habitable. Yeah. It'll keep spinning through space. It's going to be fine. The Earth is actually probably a little bit indifferent to us. But yeah, I think that's the real merit to these kinds of things, and why I want to do more. Like, something shifted in my mind, and I just know I need to do more. And yeah, whatever that looks like, I'm just going to be probably in a lot of local organizations in Canada if I'm back there. We'll see where I am.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I want to pull you into one more theoretical bubble. I feel like we've gone wide and deep in this conversation, so I'm like really excited about what you've shared. And obviously the hope is that people go find your work and kind of double click and go deeper on all the sort of various ways you've, published research, your amazing explanations on theory and philosophy. The one last thing I want to bring up is Baudrillard.
Baudrillard.
I feel like
My
if
boy.
I did an interview with you and didn't bring up Baudrillard,
Yeah.
then, once you're world famous in the future, people would look back at this interview and just shame me for my lack of research. So let's start here.
Yeah.
What would Baudrillard think of everything we just talked about and where we are now in 2025?
What would Baudrillard think? That's always a tough one. I can't speak on behalf of him. I think that, like, he wrote about Disneyland. So in Simulacra and Simulation, he writes about Disneyland, that America created Disneyland to make us think, or make Americans think, that the rest is real. So we have cartoons, and cartoons make us think that like everything else in America is real, that the strip malls everywhere are somehow like a proper way to organize like commerce or anything, or like these endless highways are somehow a way to like actually conduct travel, or like, go to Vegas and you have these simulations of the Eiffel Tower. They have that in Vegas? They do? Yeah. The Eiffel Tower and other, I've never been. So they have all this stuff.
Make sure you go before you go back to Canada.
I want to see it. I want just to experience it, because that's what Baudrillard did. He went to California, went to other parts of America to like experience America. And I use the Disneyland thing because he was one of his concerns. He had many. One of his concerns was the way in which we often like choose, or we find ways to pretend as though reality exists. And so one of Baudrillard's really key ideas is this idea of simulation, which I think a lot of people kind of get wrong, which I hate to say, because like who am I to say I have like the right understanding of Baudrillard? But Baudrillard's idea of simulation, despite what I think many people suggest, has nothing to do with like reality becoming confused with artifice in the form of like AI, in the form of digital images that look human or produced by robots that could have been produced by human or artificial intelligence or whatever. His concern isn't necessarily with the replacement of reality with artifice or simulation. His concern is that in that move, we come to think that there ever was a thing called reality. We come to think that there is this like truth out there that unites us all. And this is something that like philosophers way before him had been dealing with. I mean, you have Plato's cave, where Plato recognizes that our world is just a world of shadows, and perhaps there's something more outside of this world. You have Descartes, who's like, I can't be sure if all this world is here. Like, I can't be sure if this couch is here, if my clothes are here. Like, I can't be sure of my own body. He's like, the only thing I can be sure of is that I have my mind, because, I can doubt, his famous mantra there, I think, therefore I am. Essentially what that means is like, I can't be sure of my own body because I have an experience with my body through my senses. I can touch and see and feel my body. That's how I know it's there. But what if I was dreaming? That's how Descartes starts his thing. Like, I could be dreaming. I don't know if this is real. Can I really trust my senses? So maybe I should doubt whether or not I have a body. Maybe I should doubt if this thing is real. Maybe I should doubt this couch, this microphone, everything around me. But what I can't doubt is the very act of my doubting, because I need my mind to perform the doubting to doubt my mind. So he found this like irresolvable element to his own inquiry, where he was like, wait, the thing that remains, even through all my doubting, is my doubting, because I can't doubt away my doubt. So all the way back, and then after him, you have Immanuel Kant, who's saying like you have the phenomenal world, the world we can see, feel, and touch. And then there's the noumenal world. I'm just calling them worlds for the sake of clarity and brevity. But you have the noumenal world that exists underneath it. So you've had these, for centuries and millennia, philosophers have been discontent with this idea that there's just a reality out there. There's just a truth. And Baudrillard picks up on this to be like, it's really interesting to see this obsession with like truth, and how it's like there's so many people out there that claim to have like found it. And then you get those certain people in the world who are very committed to there being various kinds of truth about like, I don't know, gender expression, or about, what it means to properly exist in the world, or anything like that, like the truth of what it means to be anything. But that truth has always been negotiated. That's always like, even those so-called classic liberal, legitimate rationalists, the Kants of the world, the Hegels, all these type of people, they were all very suspicious of this idea that there's just this truth out there, that there's just this one way of understanding the world, because that doesn't exist. Like, we all have different tastes, we all have different senses and experiences in the world. So Baudrillard's concern has always been less about this thing called reality being replaced with like simulation, and he's more concerned with the way in which, by creating simulation, we've come to then kind of retroactively make it seem as though there was ever reality at all. Hence, we create Disneyland to make it seem as though America is real. Hence, we create conspiracy theories to make it seem as though there's like, there's actual like real truth. If we're just more really rational, then we won't have to deal with the harms of conspiracy theories. And you can insert any number of possible complaints here, or any ideas to apply his thought. But I've always been like, Baudrillard has always been one of those thinkers that's just always haunted me. Like, he's just always comes back up for me, and I can't teach his stuff because I find it too hard, not for the students, but for myself, because I just like, his prose isn't very systematic. He's not a systematic thinker. He's like a poet at times. He's just like kind of writing fiction. And so it's hard to teach in that way. So I've always had a kind of like very individual relationship with Baudrillard and like trying to grapple with his stuff in ways that are like meaningful to the way I understand the world. So the first like article I wrote was on Jordan Peterson and his obsession with like, true masculinity or true femininity, as though these things exist, and how like trans people are somehow break away from the natural order of things, which is very like obviously is problematic for so many reasons. But I use Baudrillard with that to be like, we create these narratives, or he's creating this idea that there was ever this like truth about what gender expression really looks like, because it's so different, so many different places across history. I mean, there was a long time, even in the US, in Europe, when having facial hair was a sign of being like not a man. It actually was a sign of being like closer to nature, therefore being less masculine, insofar as masculinity was for a long time measured in one's ability to adopt to these like spectral institutions, which demanded, not having facial hair, clean shaven. There was a time when like being part of the union was like one of the most masculine things you can do, that has now become something that's associated with almost like femininity or weakness or laziness. Like being part of the union, of course you're lazy, like it must be a union job or something if someone has like 4 days of vacation, they come some ridiculous stuff. Yeah, Baudrillard has always been really meaningful to me. When I was an undergrad, one of my profs was a guy named Jerry Coulter, who started the International Journal of Baudrillard Studies, and he died right after I finished undergrad. And I think that there was also that compulsion where I was like, I have to understand. I mean, he was like my mentor for a while. Like I really felt like attached to the way he thought about the world and how he viewed Baudrillard. And so I was like, I just went like full Baudrillard for a few years, just reading all of his stuff, trying to grasp his like very enigmatic thoughts, and trying to like put them into practice in my own life. And it really helped for me, because Baudrillard is like for me was one of the most instrumental thinkers to be like, to undo everything I knew about what theory should look like, what philosophy should look like, about, as strange as it might sound, Baudrillard was really one of the first to like push me to be like an anti-racist advocate and activist, because he had some horrible views. But one of the things that he was like really steadfast about was just the way in which that power works today through this like perpetual act of whitewashing, and this effort to like continually purge the world and history of all negativity in favor of just like positivity. What we find with thinkers like Sarah Ahmed, like this, what she calls the promise of happiness, or with like Lauren Berlant, a kind of cruel optimism where people are like made to, and I'm sure this is something you've encountered in looking at the climate catastrophe that we're currently living through, is this like expectation that people are meant to just be happy about it and not confront it at all, not let it affect them, because it's like either turn to nihilism and just be like, oh, there's nothing you can do, or go like full hog other way, like there is denialism, it doesn't exist at all. And Baudrillard was really instrumental for me in like pushing the boundaries of how I understood power to operate. And for him, it being a process of perfecting the world in the form of like creating a reality that leaves little negotiation. And it happens to be a reality that he diagnoses as one that happens to coincide with certain European, Eurocentric white supremacist interests. I was just reading his essay on Bosnia and the genocide in Bosnia, and he just says flat out, he's like, the violence committed against Arabs, like all throughout European history, is evidence of this like European expansionism, what he calls, in his words, New World Order. And I think at another point he calls like the New World European Order or something. It's like this effort to turn the world into Europe, is just like this extension of this logic of simulation that tries to like make of others a kind of unreality to bolster the supposed reality and truthfulness and like attachment to God, whatever that Europe claims of itself. And it uses this to justify its own violence, especially against Muslims all throughout the Middle East, but then as well against indigenous people that it viewed as being, not at the level of European progress, and so therefore needing to be like purged because these people were not up to the mantle or European superiority. So therefore, they were seen as like a negative that needed to be gotten rid of. And so Baudrillard opened up for me like a thinking about who is viewed, what groups, what people are viewed as being outside of like the social body, outside and viewed as being like almost part of a sickness or a virus that needed to be purged or dealt with. And then from there, and he wrote in his book titled Forget Foucault, he wrote another piece called Forget Baudrillard. I took that very seriously, and I just completely turned away from Baudrillard. I mean, I had my stint with him, and then I was like, the last thing that Baudrillard would want is for someone to deify him. You know, kind of like how the Marxists do with Marx. Like, it's interesting with Marx. It's like Marx was the one who ostensibly liberated the working class from, you know, the dogma of like religious subjugation. And then we return the favor by deifying Marx. And we turn we turn Marx into this kind of like godlike figure with where Capital or Communist Manifesto is our new Bible. And I was like, I could never subject Baudrillard to that. So hence I very deliberately was like, I'm gonna think about other things. I mean, he had an effect on me, and I think that for Baudrillard, he wouldn't want to become this kind of perfect, pristine thing, because I got lots of problems with Baudrillard. I mean, I have other articles I've written where it's just like pure critique of Baudrillard for his transphobia and sexism and racism. Like, these things are all present in his thought. And for that reason, he opened up the door for me. And while I can't fully explain it, to like different ideas, he was instrumental for me in like moving away from, at the time when I was just studying like theory, from just like white theory bro stuff, from the Hegels to the Deleuze's and Foucault's and all that stuff. Nietzsche. Yeah, it pushed me into reading, like finding so much inspiration in like thinkers like Sarah Ahmed, Chandra Mohanty, eventually Nora Arakat, who I would be exposed to much later. Like, all that was, I really owe Baudrillard like a debt of gratitude. I owed like the biggest debt of gratitude to my partner Hélène, who was like my biggest tutor. Hélène is like the smartest person I've ever met. It's like it's haunting. But if you want to meet someone who is able to see like the actual systemic factors, like a kind of oracle, and to be able to see through all the smoke and mirrors in a way that like I can never replicate, it's Hélène. And she was like so instrumental in pushing me to be able to recognize things in the actual harms that they are doing, instead of getting caught up with like CNN type explanations of events or New York Times type explanations of events, like, you know, the looting or the arsonists or stuff like that. Like, but actually seeing the forest for the trees. Forest through the trees? Forest for the trees?
Yeah, the phrase is like missing the forest for the trees.
Missing.
So you're seeing the forest for the trees.
Seeing the forest for the trees. Yeah, and like, I mean, the way that my mind works now, I owe so much to her in like opening that up for me and like actually being able to recognize these things, which I'm at a level that I'm leagues behind her in terms of like how she can see the world. But it has pushed me in like moving in the directions of what theory and philosophy is, to mention that again, and like seeing it as being a vast, vast ocean, and trying to present and submit myself into so many different ideas from so many different perspectives to get the best understanding of the earth and people and society, and to like, you know, do so in a way that breaks away from the simulation of just like academic philosophy, and in a way that can be meaningful to people and amplifying voices that have historically not been amplified, that have historically been associated with, in a Baudrillardian terms, with like the negative, or what doesn't even get to qualify as like considerable, and to bring that into the fold, which is what largely guides what I do, is like trying to amplify those voices. And yeah, now I just want to translate it into more like political action. And I have, as weird as it sounds, and I'm sure that there are many people who study Baudrillard out there like, how did this guy get that from him? I can't explain it. I mean, it was Baudrillard's Forget Baudrillard, where he was like, turn away from me, go to other things. And I was like, yeah, okay, I guess if you say so, dude, I'll do that. I can do that. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack with his stuff. I don't know if you have like a specific book where you're like, what does he say there?
I feel like that would be I feel like I've taken so much of your time and brain energy. I don't want to sort of subject you But maybe some other time we'll have a whole individual conversation about Baudrillard. I feel like you just
What a
sketched,
time.
yeah, you sketched a really beautiful sort of invitation for folks, with all due caveats about Baudrillard the man.
Yeah.
I do 3 questions that I ask every guest at the end of each episode. Inevitably, you've answered these to some extent already, so feel free to call that back in and double down or take it totally different direction.
Sweet.
What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
Whoa. Community organizations in their own local communities, getting involved, seeing what actual people in their communities are doing, and not being seduced by the allure of like online rage baiting as their form of political action. So like actual like local communities, people were more in tune with what was going on, and like helping them and cooperating can actually be is a lot simpler than it is often made out to seem. Often can maybe just be a few hours every month. Ideally it would be more, but like if that's all someone can give, that's a great help. Even if it comes down to like clerical stuff or helping organize like certain events, like at certain times. I mean, anything like that could be really helpful, and that I really wish people could be more in tune with, including myself. Like I have not done enough, and this is something that has been like haunts me in terms of like the lack of political action I've taken throughout my life, and like the privilege that I've just enjoyed, despite the things that I have done. Like I just am dissatisfied with myself. But yeah, I mean that's what comes to mind.
I love that answer. What is one resource you recommend for making better sense of reality?
Urgent Futures podcast.
Oh, stop.
I guess I don't need to plug your thing. You're already here listening.
Yeah,
to it.
you made it.
Oh God, to be better in tune with, in emphasizing locality and being local, talking to people, which is maybe strange, but given today's like current political landscape, it just feels like these politicians don't talk to people. And I feel like a lot of the way that politics is currently orchestrated in our world is without an actual attention to people, like what they actually need, what do they care about, like what is actually moving them. And to get a better sense of reality, I think, is to get away from the idea that there is a one reality. And I think that can come about by like engagement with others. And engaging with others is just a fantastic way to see the world for all of its beautiful plurality outside of like the liberal plural sense, like liberalism and just like identity politics and all the negative associations with that, in favor of like understanding people for all their complexities that aren't reduced to preconceived notions about what they are based on their identity, whatever that looks like to them. But yeah, I don't know. Then you can watch my channel. I don't know. I'll break down some books for you. I'm the vocal spark notes. Maybe it'll be useful to you. I've also been told it's great to help people fall asleep. I'm willing to accept that. It's sick. I mean, insomnia is a real thing.
Hey, I mean, you have a very nice voice, a very comforting presence, but also it's good for staying awake as well.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, I will answer my own question and say Theory and Philosophy has been a huge, huge resource for me.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. And just to call it out, like one thing you do, I think, exceptionally well among a lot of different things is when you'll take a term like dialectics, and really quickly fly through the different ways different thinkers have used it. That is like a 15-minute little dose where you might be super fluent in, Hegel, but you have no idea about Sir Ahmed or something like that.
Right.
And so it's a way to connect what you might already know to things you maybe don't know, or if you don't know any of it, it's a great invitation to all of it. So shout out those episodes.
Well. I mean, it's a job of passion for me. I mean, I love teaching, and I love the idea, because when I was in grad school, I was so alienated. I struggled so much in understanding what anyone was saying, and then I felt like I was like, I can, I'm going to read these books that everyone's talking about, and I'm going to, put up what I think is the text itself in terms of my own analysis, that I try to keep as close to the text as I can, just to help people who might be like feeling alienated if they're in grad school, or if they're just want to expose themselves to these ideas, to help them understand their life and the world and the way that all these systems work, to understand oppression, in all of its forms. Because I mean, let's use these tech platforms as best we can against these tech platforms. I think.
Cheers. Last question. What is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Wow. One moment when my sense of reality was. I think to some extent, a reality that's been like really imposed on me has been certain ideas about masculinity that have never really sat with me. Yet I always really felt like I had to approximate those things, and I still do. Like I still feel the weight of that, all the expectations that masculinity has put on me. And I had a realization when I was a young kid, and I remember once sitting in a kitchen of like my aunt's house with my aunt and my mom, and they were talking about like other people in the family and stuff. And I remember looking outside, and I think I saw my uncle and my dad and stuff, and they were doing stuff outside. And I just remember feeling like really comfortable talking to my mom and my aunt about what they were talking about. And I knew what like my dad, my uncle and stuff were talking about out there. And that was a moment. I was really young. I was like 8 or 9 when I was like, I feel a lot more comfortable with like women in terms of my masculinity, like as far as how I identify, like being in that kind of space, as opposed to what is expected of me and what should have been expected of me and what I should have been doing as like the reality of being a man. Like, and that was the first moment, I think, where it kind of started to, I started to rethink what it meant for me to be a man, which is like so much of our lives that I think that, the gendered expectations put onto people is like, it often goes unrecognized and unexamined just because, we're told like, just this is the way it should be. And that's it. There's little room for negotiation. But that was like, as banal as that is, it was one of the first moments where I was really like, everything I know just and have been told, it just doesn't resonate with me. Like the sense of who I'm supposed to be, the world I'm supposed to live in, how I'm supposed to navigate that world. It just didn't seem all that right to me. So that was one of the first moments. More recently, seeing the footage out of Gaza, just my sense of what I thought humans were like capable of doing to one another, because this is like post World War II. We have the International Court of Justice. We like hold these people accountable. I'm like, we have laws in place for these things to defend people. We recognize people and their humanity despite their statehood. This is how I thought like the world worked, and then seeing just on full display this kind of violence, it shifted my view of the world, but it shifted my view of myself in that I was like, am I really going to pretend to myself like this kind of violence just started now? Am I really going to pretend as though it's just like Israel? Like, why didn't I care about like Sudan? Why don't I care about all the mining that's going on in so many different African countries? Why do I not have the same kind of like anger about so many other things? And there's a number of reasons for that. But that was like a moment where suddenly I became so attuned to these other things and wanted to like read up and understand so much about it, because it just opened me up to just seeing the world like totally differently, understanding humanity totally differently, and understanding how kind of the global order operates and how it's not for the people. It actually sees people as being quite disposable, and how scary it is to kind of really come to terms with that, and how much of a sign of it is of my own privilege that I only was able to like really come to terms with that in my late 20s, early 30s. Like, wow, what a privileged life I've lived. Like, bravo, David. But that has just been so world changing for me. And it just completely overturned my idea of reality and what I understood the world and reality to really be, and its principles, if it has any, like, and yeah, how it works.
Amazing. Those are two really powerful answers. First one is not banal at all.
It's just it was just some standing there looking outside, and it was a moment that just shifted how I viewed myself, and yeah.
Well, as I said, this has been a really, really fun conversation, to say nothing of how illuminating. And I really appreciate your time.
Ruby,
where can people find
thank
you?
Where can you find me? At Theory and Philosophy is the place. My email's on there if someone wants to reach out. You can find me on Instagram under. I don't even want to plug the meta anymore. Now, well, I shouldn't have wanted to plug it before. You can find me in other places. Theory and Philosophy is where I like really. That's how I identify my online presence. So type that in, and you'll be able to find me. But yeah, that's kind of my. I don't have a Substack or anything. I haven't gotten to the point of like writing for putting political commentary into writing or anything like that. But maybe I should. Maybe one day. But yeah, if anyone wants to reach out, feel free, and I'll try to answer you.
Amazing.
Great. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you again. Yeah. This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.